Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. And the month of December has truly started out being the month of Russia, as we have seen that they have managed to make significant territorial advances, with only the Ukrainians being able to counterattack and regain territory once in the first 5 days, with the Russians on a constant advance throughout the front line. We start out in the Zaporizhia front, where we see that the Russian forces have yet again managed to regain some territories here in the Zaporizhia front. Excuse the map, as there has come a technical issue which forced me to load in an old version of the map from last June. The point being here that the Russian forces managed to advance here in the north of Avdiivka, trying to negate some of the Ukrainian advances. So we're seeing that there's continuous positional fighting here in the area. However, the Ukrainian forces have not been able to make any advancements in the Zaporizhia front through the start of this month. And we see in this picture here, this is a satellite image from the middle of September, which shows clearly where the fighting has taken place due to how much shelling has happened throughout the front line, as well as the no man's land, which was apparent throughout the spring and winter of last year, which we saw a lot of fighting taking place, after which the front line stabilized, after which we saw no significant movement in the Zaporizhia front. Now that it has restarted, we saw a lot of fighting, and the evidence of that is here in the satellite image. We then move on to the Avdiivka area, where we see to the northern parts of the front line, fighting is taking place in the northern outskirts of the coke plant, where the Russian forces are pressuring the Ukrainian forces here to the south of Stepove, pushing back this line of control slightly back to just beyond the intersection here between the two roads to the north of the coke plant. And the Russian forces managed to advance here to the south of the waste heap. They have yet to recapture the water treatment plant here to the south of the waste heap, but they have managed to capture the road between it and the coke plant, as well as the road going through here in the north, pushing back the Ukrainian forces from that to the Dacha area here just south of it. We then move on to the Bakhmut area. However, we have to quickly go over the Orikhiv direction, where the Russian forces managed to counterattack here to the northwest of the waste heaps here to the west of Orikhiv. So the Ukrainian forces still have control over the waste heap here, but there's a second one here to the north of it by the lake. The Russian forces counterattacked and have managed to regain some territories and forest patches here to the west of it. So we are seeing some back and forth positional fighting here to the west of Orikhiv, outside of the city. We then move on to the Bakhmut direction, where we here see the Russian forces manage to advance two areas to the northern flank of Bakhmut, where they've managed to advance in the direction of the northwest of Khomove, where they are fighting against the Ukrainian fortified positions here to the northwest of Khomove. And we're also seeing further advancements in the direction of Avdiivka. We see these two images here, which gives an indication of what has happened in the northern flank of Bakhmut over the past 6 months. First, we have this image by Military Summary, which shows the areas which the Russian forces have recaptured since the start of their counterattack in the northern flank of Bakhmut. After the Russian capture of Bakhmut on the 20th of May, the Ukrainian forces led a counterattack to try and recapture the flanks to the north and to the south of Bakhmut, where we at times even heard news from the pro-Ukrainian side that they had semi-encircled Bakhmut. But in the end, they never captured Orikhiv, they never captured Yahidne. At some point, they actually managed to enter Orikhiv, but they were soon pushed out, and since then, they hadn't really gained any positions across the dam here in the south of Orikhiv by the reservoir. So we see here that the Russian forces managed to capture a lot of territory. And that territory is indicated here with the maximum Russian army and PMC Wagner advances on the 11th of May 2023. This is according to Syriac maps. So we see that there is some territory missing before the Russians fully recapture everything they had prior to the Ukrainian counterattack. But what we do see is that the Russian forces are very close to it, despite the 6-month-long Ukrainian offensive here in the Bakhmut direction. The Russian forces are now already closing in on the line of which they were pushed back from initially. According to some pro-Russian sources, they've also managed to recapture the railways here to the east of Klishchiivka, which means that the Russian forces are in a position where they've managed to recapture half of Avdiivka, almost all of it. Fighting continues by the village, or whatever's left of it, of the ruins, and fighting continues in the heights here to the east of Klishchiivka as well as to the west of it. So this means that the Russian forces are currently attacking from 3 different directions, where they're trying to gain full control over Klishchiivka in a counterattack. So we're seeing that the Russian forces are heavily pressuring the Ukrainian ones, and yet we are seeing that the Ukrainians are having a hard time facing that. And we see that this is the territory from prior to the offensive of the Ukrainian forces in June. The one that I had to recover was one from prior to the offensive. So we're seeing that the territory the Ukrainian forces ended up taking is about this much, which in the end, after 6 months of fighting, you can hardly call a successful offensive. And now we're already seeing that the Russian forces are threatening almost all of that advancements by attempting to capture the fortifications here to the west of Klishchiivka. If the Russian forces manage to capture these fortifications, they're able to cut off all of the Ukrainian forces to the south of Klishchiivka in the area here beyond the front line. So we see that the Russian forces are in a very favorable position by holding their forest lines to the north of Klishchiivka, and with their control over Bakhmut as well as their pressure on the northern flank, this shows that the Ukrainian forces are hardly pressed and are not able to completely deal with the situation. At the same time, the Russian forces in this area are reporting that the Ukrainian forces aren't launching a lot of artillery. This can mean one of 2 things. Either the Ukrainian forces are running low on artillery, therefore they have to save whatever they have to build up for important operations, or the second option is that the Ukrainian forces are planning an ambush similar to that north of Avdiivka when the Russian forces launch an attack there, where they try to fall back a little bit, the Russian forces advance and overextend, after which they ambush the Russian forces. So it could be either of two of these things, in my opinion. So with these developments that are already taking place prior to the Russian reinforcements arriving, and now we are seeing the Russian reinforcements arriving, including Wagner soldiers. So this is reported by Wagner insider sources. The former Wagner soldiers at Bakhmut to strengthen their defenses as well as to launch counterattacks. So we're seeing that the Russian forces will likely look to extend the front line to a canal line, which will allow them to strengthen their fortifications and allow them to protect the front line. So we saw how these canal defenses were the most successful throughout the period of the Ukrainian offensive, and therefore they are a must-have for the Russian army. And at the same time, we move further north and we see that there's been no territorial changes. There's some fighting taking place northwest of Kreminna, but that's about it. In this video, I'm specifically hard against the Western propaganda in the Ukraine war. The reason for this is that I'm going to present to you a BBC article. This BBC article talks about what a soldier fighting in the Kherson direction and one of the soldiers who was crossing the Dnieper River to fight in the eastern bank of the Dnieper River in the Kherson region. So this soldier here talks about how the front line is hell. These quotes here, the Ukrainian soldiers' quotes are below in bold. One of them really was very interesting to me. He says, and I quote, "We thought after we made it there, the enemy would flee. And then we could calmly transport everything we needed, but it didn't turn out that way." The fact that he thinks this in the first place shows that he's become a victim to the propaganda. Before going to the front line, before fighting, he thought that the Russian army was weak, demotivated, under-equipped, and all of the things that the Western media keeps telling you day after day. The Ukrainian media tells the same to its own citizens. So information is very dangerous, whether it is accurate or not. The way it is presented makes the difference. And I try to present the difference in a very neutral way, try to make it as clear as possible. And that is how I try to tell the story from both sides and try to explain what is actually happening, what is the actual power balance, and all of these things to give you a proper idea of what is actually happening. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.